Hey there, it's Andrea, and welcome to the Voice of Influence podcast. Today I have with me Jim Vaselopulos. There we go, I got it. Jim, it's
Perfect.
so great to have you here on the Voice of Influence podcast. I'm looking forward to talking about your book.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
So, you just came out with a book called Clarity. Tell us about this basic concept of why it's so important for people to have clarity. Why write a whole book on it?
Yeah, it's fair question. I wrote the book in large part because what I wanted to do was mirror what my clients value when we work together. People would always say, "Hey, Jim, that was very wise," or "I appreciate your wisdom." But really, what they appreciated was the clarity they got after our discussions. And I think it's one of those things where if you think about the world we live in, there's no one who's telling you like, "Hey, I could use more work, or I could be a little, more busy." And so having clarity is being able to focus your efforts on the things that matter most and to have the maximum impact on the things that are going to matter most. So it's about stripping away that which does not matter, focusing on that which does move the needle and does matter. And then also knowing the right way to go about doing it so you get maximum impact for the least amount of effort. And that's kind of what I help people with. And that's what the book is really about.
Hmm. It sounds like it's like their perspective, but it's also what they want to do, how they're going to move forward. Is that right?
Yeah. It's most of the time when I'm working with people, it's not like, "Oh, Jim, you know my business better than I do." I mean, there's some things I know, but when I'm coaching people, it's they know their business pretty well. And it's a matter, and many times people know what to do. A lot of times it's knowing the order in which you do things, the sequence of events, because we get impatient. We want to do things right now. And it's like, "Oh, I got to hurry up and do this." And it's like, yeah, it's important. And a lot of times we make these decisions on what to do on like, this is a good idea or a bad idea. And usually that's not the way to look at the question you ask yourself. Is this the good idea right now? Is this, and so many times the answer is, it's a great idea, just not yet. And so that requires an understanding of like what order we should do things in, what timing, because the difference between, let's say, and sports analogies aren't always the best, but let's say the difference between someone hitting a home run and a foul ball is really timing. Everything else was the same, but it's really just a matter of timing. So knowing the timing with which to do something helps you have maximum impact. And then a lot of times it's having the patience to wait. Because if you need to wait for something for proper timing, a lot of times it's really hard to wait because we lack the confidence in ourselves, confidence in processes, confidence in our team. We don't trust things. And so those three elements are really, really the, 400-500 level course, for clarity is really understanding when to do things for maximum benefit and impact.
That's a good point. And to me, when I think about that, I'm also thinking about like how much is required for maximum benefit and impact. Like you were talking about the people wanting to move forward quickly and sometimes jumping the gun. I also find that the goal, a lot of times what people want is like a button to push or something really clear and quick, but sometimes it's a little more than that. Do you find that too?
Well, yeah, I mean, because I think a lot of times what we end up doing is everyone likes the quick fix, right? If I could take the pill, and solve all my problems, I can eat as much, red meat as I want. I can exercise as little as I want. All these things that we know, avoid probably recipes for better health and all kinds of other stuff that we know work. Okay. Same in business. I think the interesting thing that we do in the business world is we tend to treat our symptoms. Okay. So we have a lot of symptoms that we have in our business world that we treat that aren't really the root cause. And it takes a lot of work to get down to the root cause and to find what's really underlying an issue. So, a really good example of this is like being too busy. We got a bunch of people who are too busy. You know what? Let's train them on time management so they can manage their time better. And maybe that's the case, but it usually isn't. Okay. People tend to be pretty efficient with their time because people tend to want to be a little bit lazy. No one wants to work harder than they need to. And so, when we take a look at it, is one of these things we neglect is, why are we too busy? Are we spending too much time in meetings? Maybe the problem is we don't know how to run good meetings. Are we too busy because we don't know how to prioritize projects, because we say yes to everything, we never say no to anything? There are all kinds of reasons why we are too busy, but it's usually, if we just treat that busyness factor, it doesn't solve the problem. And it just maybe makes it go away for a little while, just like aspirin will make the pain of something go away for a little while. But the underlying issue is, yeah, you sprained your hamstring. We need to deal with that. We need to heal that before you can be better. So we like the quick fixes. They're very attractive to us, just like our medical quick fixes are attractive to us as well.
Yeah. So how do you use curiosity to dial in on what the root cause is, or know whether or not it's something that can be a quick fix, or if it needs, and treat the symptom, or if it needs to go deeper?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so one of the things you got to think about stuff. And, curiosity is really the key that says, like, do I really want to think about this more? I just want to like dismiss something and let it go into the shadows and just move on to the next thing and continue playing whack-a-mole? So the reality is, when you're evaluating symptoms, okay, you might want to ask yourself, why is this a problem? Why do we have a culture that seems to be broken and or effective? Why are people not being held accountable? And say, like, oh, my people aren't being held accountable. I need to do this. I need to, have more meetings because people are out of alignment. It's like, why are they out of alignment? Let's understand the problem before we start throwing solutions at things. And so curiosity is that thing inside you that says, like, I need to understand why. Just telling me the answer, whether it's right or wrong, is irrelevant. Just like, why is this happening? A lot of times it just takes asking why 4 or 5 times and digging down and saying, like, here's what's really going on. Now, one of the great benefits that came out of like writing a book is, because I've been doing this stuff for a long time, but it kind of forces you to have your story really tight. You got to understand things. And so the more I started writing about, let's say, the first section of the book, which is all about business symptoms, was there's a common thing they all have. They all share one common trait. And these are things that we often think of are like problems in business, but actually they're symptoms. All the symptoms are outcomes. They're outcomes of other things. So like we could say, like, my business is unprofitable, so profitability is my problem. Profitability, whether it's, high or low, is an outcome of other things. So profitability or lack of profitability, which would be the typical business problem we look at, is an outcome. So it's really a symptom that is the outpouring of other things. And when you understand that something's a symptom, you should use your curiosity and say, like, all right, something else is going on. And so what we're trying to do is help people know when to dig further. I think it's always good to dig further with a lot of questions. I think that's great. But one of the more misunderstood things is like culture. People say, like, well, we're going to fix our culture. Or we need to bring in, and I'm probably going to ruffle some feathers here, is like, some consultants to help us with our culture. Like, I'm okay. Like, I want a healthy culture. I don't think there's anyone who wants to work in a business with an unhealthy culture or a bad culture. But the reality is, culture is an outcome of decisions you make every day. You can write something and put it up on your wall and talk about it every day when you start your day. Say, quality is job one, or whatever you want your culture to reflect. But if your decisions you make on a daily basis don't reflect that, if where you're spending your most scarce resources, which are like time and money in a business, if they don't reflect the decisions that support that, that's not really your culture.
Exactly.
And that's when you get to an unhealthy culture. So understanding that, like, if you have cultural problems, that's great, but that's a symptom, just like a fever is. It says, well, you should probably dig a little deeper and find out if you got strep throat, find out if you got COVID, find out, because it's something else that's causing the fever. And that's really the way I like to talk about this stuff in the book, is to help people at least know where to address their problems and stop wasting time playing whack-a-mole with symptoms.
Yeah. And how you address things in the book, you use fictional stories. Can you tell us, like, a lot of times people use real stories. I find real stories kind of hard to use sometimes, but why did you choose to go that route with the book?
Yeah, like you, I've been doing a podcast. We've had this leadership podcast for, about as long as you've had yours. And people always say, like, who were the most impactful guests you had, and this and that. And it's always the people who told good stories.
Yeah.
I remember the stories years later. It's like, I remember these stories. And when I'm trying to help people with their businesses, I'm always trying to say, like, here's an analogy that works. People like analogies. They like stories. They like these allegories. It's why we still tell Aesop's fables, because they're these allegories that are analogies, but they're also in story form. And so, in business school, I always thought case studies were a great way to learn. And I think they are a great way to learn, but case studies can be a little bit textbooky. And so I wanted to tell stories that were rich and, where you connected with the characters. And so there's these 3 fictional stories of 3 different characters. There's a woman who's run an environmental consulting company. There's a VP of sales at a software company that's, got challenges. And then there's like the general manager of a manufacturing company. And I will tell you, like you dig in and you read it, you're going to identify with these folks and the problems they're having. And you're going to be like, oh my gosh. And I thought the format would be more impactful for people. And I thought it would be a format that would be, engage people and draw them in a little deeper. And at least the early results are for people that are coming back and telling me about, like, hey, I read the book, and they're not talking to me about like, hey, I really like what you talked about with regard to alignment or this and that. They're saying like, man, when Diana hit the wall and had to do this, that really resonated with me. So when someone comes back talking about one of these main characters, Diana, Sam, or George, I know that the story format really hit home. And that's what I want to do, is I want to have an impact. I don't just want to write a textbook.
Yeah. Well, and how do you see that story format impacting the way that leaders can mentor or pass on knowledge like you're doing,
Yeah. And I
like
think
within their companies?
that's a great question. And I think, it's modeled in the book.
Yeah.
So, I'm one of these guys, like, do I do sales training? Yes. People have hired me to do sales training. I've done sales training before, and there's a specific level of expertise I have. But if you ask me like where I learned it, I didn't learn it in a class.
Yeah.
Okay. I learned it because I sat next to someone who was really good at it and I watched them do it. And then afterwards we sat down and I was coached by them to just say, listen, next time I want you to do this. And then I would do it. And then afterwards we'd go out and we'd get lunch and they'd say, all right, you remember that moment when you said this? You might want to try saying it like this next time. That's how you learn complex things. And so while I realize I'm writing a book and you can't learn to swim writing a book. You can't learn to ride a bike, right? Reading a book. But I tried to embed within the stories the same type of kind of mentorship where people are learning things as they go through these stories. So as humans, we wouldn't be as far as we are in society if we didn't learn from other people's stories and other people's mistakes. So hopefully there are some stories and some similar circumstances that people can identify with so that they can walk away and go, yeah, I learned something.
Hmm. Yeah, I find stories incredibly helpful and yet sometimes difficult to come up with. Not just for
Mm-hmm.
myself, but I find that other people have a hard time just coming up with them. And I wonder if some of that has to do with some guardedness around our own transparency, like whether or not I'm willing to share a part of my own story. What are your thoughts on transparency and sharing in that format?
Well, I think from a leadership standpoint, vulnerability is important and you got to be transparent. And, people don't want to talk to someone who presents themselves as perfect because reality is we know no one is. Okay. And so it always comes across flat.
Yeah.
And so there are a lot of stories that are these fictional stories, but at the beginning of each section, I have a personal story. And at the beginning of each section, I share a personal story that is, in most cases, self-deprecating, in most cases, but it's memorable. And if you would entertain me, I'll just like share like one
Please,
story
that
from the
would be
book
great.
because I want this podcast to be memorable for your listeners. And I also think it's like, this is where the power is.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where I started realizing the value of paying attention to small things. So years ago, my dad came to this country and he was an immigrant and, he got a college degree and he was educated, but like no one wanted to hire the guy with the funny name and the thick accent. And so he ended up going into a business with his brother, and they owned a liquor store, which was, I don't recommend that for anyone. Okay. It's a terrible business. It put kids through college. It put roof over our head. But terrible hours, terrible business. And low margin. And, because of that, he had ulcers, and the ulcers were like super profound. And so he had like boxes upon boxes of antacid, and he was always seeing the doctor to get him refilled because it was like prescription antacid at the time. And, and so one of these times his stomach was flaring up and he was having these pains. And so he's like, I got to go to the doctor and probably get a refill on my prescription, maybe something stronger. So he goes into the doctor, and this Dr. Susan Nelson, love her to death. She's a wonderful lady. Takes him in, and like he runs through all the symptoms, and he's just expecting to walk out of there with a nice handshake and a new prescription and to go to Walgreens and get it filled. Well, what ends up happening is, she says she does what most people would do and say like, that's probably what it is, but I'm going to follow my process. And you've said a few things that are a little bit different. So I'm a little curious. So I'm going to ask, why? Is something stressful going on at work right now? Not really. Is something else going on? Not really. So things aren't adding up. She just say, hey, why don't you lay down on the table real quick? She does that thing where you like press into someone's abdomen with your fingers, which I never really understood. Like, what are they really looking for? But she goes down and she goes, all right, Mr. Vaselopulos sits him up on the table. She goes, good news is I don't believe your ulcer's flaring up. He's like, oh, that's good. And, my parents were like older couple. They did everything together. So my mom's in there, in the room with them. She goes, but Mr. and Mrs. Vaselopulos, I've got some bad news. I believe you have what's called a AAA, an abdominal aortic aneurysm, and it's rather large, and I can feel it. And if you don't go to the hospital today, you're going to be in big trouble. This is not something you should ignore. I'm ordering you to go directly to the hospital right now. They're like, really? Is it that urgent? He's like, you'll probably be in surgery before the day is out, because if you were to have this burst on the steps of the hospital, there's nothing we can do to save you. And so that hit home with them. Mm-hmm. Now, he went into the hospital, had surgery. I came in from out of town because I was working in a different city at the time. The family rallied, he got healthy, and, he spent another, 30 years with us. Thank God. And so this doctor, we could credit the surgeons for saving his life, but it was really the diagnostician, Dr. Nelson, who said she wasn't lazy. She took the time to be curious. She took the time to pay attention to small details and saved his life. Mm. Without that, my dad never would have met my wife. Never, my kids never would have met him or been, mentored as a grandfather with him. So you sit there and say like, that was really important, but it was one of those things that we do daily in business where we could just be lazy and just like, take some, call me in a week, see if it goes away. Because she heard small things and she paid attention to small details. And that's what I want to have come across in this book, is like, know when to pay attention, know when to dig deeper, know when to ask that secondary and tertiary question. So you can say, hey, let's get to the bottom of, guess what? It could be important. And if we don't, maybe our business doesn't disappear like my father would have, if the AAA burst, but you're certainly going to be dealing with problems you probably could have avoided if you were just a little bit curious.
Man, first of all, I love the story. Second of all, I think about how busy people are right now, and they're telling me that they are. And I think that a lot of times people feel like they don't have time to, or they aren't taking the time to be curious, to do to put in that extra work. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, everyone's too busy. There's no doubt about it. Okay. But you can't dig into everything, but you have to be a little bit curious to know when to dig, when you're probably barking up the wrong tree. And then over time, what at least that lesson with my father taught me is like, wow, you got to pay attention to details. And what I really ask people to do is say, hey, pay attention to the details, learn, because then you can become more efficient. And the subtitle of the book is, work less, achieve more. Okay. So, you sit there and you say like, wow, if I could do that, that would be great. Well, I'm giving you the recipe on how to do that. And the first thing is strip away the symptoms. The next, section is like understand when your emotions and all the other things that get in our way and the assumptions that we make really cloud our ability to focus on only that which is important. That's really the key. There's usually a few things that are way more important than other things, but you have to strip away all the BS, for lack of a better word, that gets in our way to really focus on that which matters. And then once you figure out those things, it's a matter of like, okay, there might be 3 or 4 things. What order do I do them in to get maximum benefit? And how do I understand exactly how to do it most efficiently as possible? And, I think that, one of those things that like, I don't mind like home repair projects. Like I don't mind doing stuff like that. I find a certain amount of visceral satisfaction doing them. And I can do them as good as most of the carpenters I would hire, but a carpenter might come in and do it in a weekend. It'll take me 9 months to do it. Okay. And it's not just because I'm busy, but it's because like, I don't know the tricks. I don't know how to do it fast. I haven't done it a million times. And so some of these things that we deem to be most important in our business, and we say like, this is really one of those critical linchpin type of activities. It's like, are you paying attention to the details? Because there's a concept called conscious competence that I think really is the thing that opens the door to working less and accomplishing more. And it's that level of saying, I understand what I'm doing and I'm very effective at what I'm doing. And now I know the things that really move the needle and the things that don't. So personal journey of mine. Okay. One of my business partners, several business partners, but we were like building this services business. And we knew that if we were going to sell the services business, you only get so much money for it. But if we had a product business, we'd get a lot more money when we went to sell it. And so we decided to build a product company alongside our services company. Great software company. We knew that if this was successful, we'd make a lot of money. Wonderful. So 2 of my partners are like, hey, we got to go off and run the product company. You need to stay back and kind of run the software. And the thing that I need you to cover up on and do the most of is sales. It's like, I don't really like doing it, but I'll do it. So I was good at it. I did it. And I was able to fill up the void that my other partner left, which was significant. And it was taking, 60, 78 hours a week to do that. Well, he's like, we probably need more sales. So you probably can't work anymore. Can you teach other people how to do this? And I was like, no, I just kind of know what to do. And he's like, well, then you're not done. You need to figure out how to do this so we can scale it. You need to figure out the recipe so other people can cook the same recipe.
Yeah.
And so that really forced me to pay attention to these small little things I was doing. Why was I doing this at this time? And if you think about it, it encompasses everything I was doing. But once you develop conscious competence, you have this unfair advantage. Now, I will tell you that I was working these huge long hours. Once I put in the time to figure out what I was doing and realized that doesn't even move the needle. That's a total waste of time. This is the stuff that matters. I took that week that I was working, that was like 60, 70 hours a week on average, and with some 80 and 100-hour weeks in there. I got it down to 1 day a week. And at the end, I was probably working 4 to 6 hours and hitting the same sales numbers year after year after year. Then it was like, now let me teach other people how to do this. With the time I had left over, I started researching psychology. I started reading more business books. I started looking into all kinds of other disciplines like behavioral economics. So I even sharpened the sword even more by knowing like, hey, you want to supercharge this statement when you're closing? Say this way, and it'll be even better. So you have to make the investment, but you have to make it in the right spots. So what I hope to do is help people find the right spots, make the investment, develop your own conscious competence, and then you'll find that you can get so much more done with so much less effort. But you got to be willing to do the effort. And that's what a lot of people aren't willing to do. It's like, just give me the pill.
Yeah.
There is no pill.
Oh, so good. I love that. And Jim, do you mind if I ask you a couple questions that might not be related to the book so much?
Sure.
Yeah. I've been, I think that some of the things that businesses are facing right now have to do with, we already covered kind of the overwhelm a little bit, but also the newer generations that are coming into the workforce and feeling like people are different than us and they have a different work ethic and all this sort of stuff. And so we've been doing a lot of talking to folks just to try to understand where people are at, where they're coming from. I'm curious if you have seen businesses struggling with this too, and what insights that you have just on integrating the incoming workforce.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is such a great topic of conversation. I don't mind diving in at all. So at the very surface level, let's just, call this out. Like there is no generation that has faced, humanity and aging that hasn't looked back at the prior generation and just said, oh my God, the world's, going to pot,
Yep.
these young kids don't get it. I mean, Socrates, I think, complained about Plato and Aristotle. I mean, so the reality is, you know, this is an old story. What we can look at though is what's going on in the environment today and what are the conditions. So on the hopeful side, I will say that, some of the younger generations, it's really important for them to understand why. Okay. You can't just say do this and then just say because back when I started my career, it was like, because that's the way we do it. And it was like, okay, and so, you did what you were supposed to do. This generation says, it doesn't make sense, or why, or I need to know the backstory. That's a level of curiosity that they have, which we should embrace, because that's the kind of curiosity that opens the doors to working less and achieving more. And it's, overall, what I try and say is like, that's how you get business wisdom. So let's not take this asset that they have and beat it out of them. Okay. That is the wrong strategy. Let's embrace that, engage them with that. Now, part of the challenge is that demographically, we have a situation in our economy that we really haven't had in a long time. And that is that we have more workers, more active workers retiring out of the workforce than younger workers replacing them. Mm-hmm. So we've got relatively low unemployment, even in a bad economy. Okay. Usually bad economies would kind of quiet insolent behavior, for lack of a better word. You have workforce. And, I think in the .com bust, people were making ridiculous requests like, I won't work for you unless I have, 40, days off, and you pay for my ski pass at Vail, and, you buy me a $2,000 chair. And it was like, okay, but, a bad economy fixed that pretty darn quick. Okay. Well, now we're going into a bad economy, but the demographics don't favor us because there isn't a good supply of workers. So some of this behavior is kind of existing a little longer. And so, we've got the proverbial tail wagging the dog a little bit. And I think that's something that employers are having a tough time with. But I think it will shake out. It's just going to take longer to shake out because we don't have the suddenness of a bad economy with people who can't find jobs all of a sudden saying like, well, maybe it wasn't so bad that I only got, 30 days off a year, and maybe it's this chair is not, as uncomfortable as I thought. So I think that corrective behavior is not quite coming as fast as it probably needs to. But this is a reality we're going to have to get used to. So there is some good, there is some bad, but the reality is it's change. And if we think we're going to be working in a world without change, we're fooling ourselves. It's always changing.
True. So true. Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I mean, like you said, it's not something that we haven't heard before. I mean, all of us probably came into the workforce with everybody looking at us saying, what in the world is this generation going to do?
Oh yeah.
Kids these days. But they do face unique challenges that we haven't faced or that we're facing with a lot more experience. So it's just interesting to see how we all interact and work together to make work with them in it. Yeah.
I think one of the really interesting, and if you don't mind me going off on a tangent, but cut me off if you want, but like, I think one of the really interesting things that does pose a challenge to kind of management today's workforce is I think there's a huge push right now for people to kind of question capitalism. Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm. Is it like, even like democracy, but I'm not going to go there, but like people question like capitalism, like, is it broken? Do we need something else? And, I'm okay questioning everything. Okay. I think we should always entertain someone's curiosity and their questions. But, when people kind of approach me with that, I always talk about like a few small things. I say, listen, if you were to be in a prison, okay, there is always something that shows up inside a prison called the black market. And the black market is the purest form of capitalism in what would be a very contained society that is as socialist as it gets, okay? Or is, let's say, controlling as it gets. Yet the black market always shows up. The black market thrived in every communist and thrives to this day in every communist country. And strangely, well, we don't think it, happens in the United States. Probably the most pure socialist system in the United States is the US military. Because if I'm a member of the US military, almost everything's provided for me. Our resources are allocated by a controlling body. Everything happens. Yet the people who seem to be able to get things done in the military are the ones that kind of work around the system. It's always been that Don Rickles type, character who, can acquire anything or get things that they need to get through and solve a creative problem. The black market always exists, and the black market is the purest form of capitalism. So once you start accepting that a little bit, you have to understand that like it's not going away. It's not perfect, but it's probably never going away. And because it's really hard for people to be productive in the business world if they reject capitalism. And it's not to say there, aren't ways for us to be more, I think, honorable with, what we do with our profits. There's always room to do that. And I think conscious capitalism and a bunch of other movements like the B Corp movement are certainly, worthy additions to how we use our capital. Even companies like Patagonia that are like really aware of their impact. But you can't be against capitalism and really be manageable in this, world.
Interesting perspective. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. So, Jim, I want to make sure to give people a chance to find your book and you. So, can you share with us where they can look for you and look for clarity?
Yeah. So I'll kind of give an example of my book right now. Okay.
Okay.
So Jim Vaselopulos. Okay. If you find me on LinkedIn, great. You can find a lot of information there, but my name is long. It's hard to spell. You're probably going to get it wrong. You're not going to find me. Okay. But you could try. Okay. That's fine. You go to my website, raftiadvisors.com. Okay. Find all kinds of information about me, but you're going to be like, how do I spell Rafti? And it doesn't make any sense. And you're probably not going to find it there either. Okay. So I'm going to give you the one that's the easiest that unlocks everything else. So you don't need to bother with all the others. You can forget about the other stuff. Jim V, you don't even need to ever know my last name. Go to businesswisdom.com. And my guess is it's easier to memorize. Businesswisdom.com. You'll find my website. It'll have links to my LinkedIn profile. It'll have links to my book. It'll have links to my Rafti Advisors website. So just remember that one and you're good to go.
Perfect. And just in case somebody can't figure that out, we'll have it in the show notes.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay, one last question for you. This is the Voice of Influence podcast. What would be the last piece of advice that you'd want to give to somebody who wants to have a voice of influence in their company?
Great question. And once again, I will tell you, leave every conversation with every individual that you engage with. If you enter those conversations with a notion in the beginning of that conversation that when this ends, I want that person, Andrea, I want you to walk away from this discussion feeling 1 inch taller. If you can walk away feeling 1 inch taller, I will have had a positive influence on you. I'm not trying to do anything other than help you enjoy your weekend more, have a better day, be more productive, see more sunshine than you would have seen otherwise, see possibilities where you were seeing roadblocks. If I can help you feel 1 inch taller, you will be influencing people at the individual level. You will be influencing the world at a greater level. And if you can do that on a repeated, regular basis, your influence will grow in ways you never imagined.
1 inch taller. Love that. Thank you so much, Jim, for being a voice of influence for our listeners today.
Thank you, Andrea.
Appreciate it.
I really appreciate it. Thank you.